Would you believe it if I told you that a dog dug for hours in the snow alone until he found a missing child, when even the firefighters no longer believed it? It sounds like a movie scene, but what you're going to hear now is one of those stories that defies logic and messes right with us. A moment in which the courage of an animal overcomes fear, fatigue, and even limits that many human beings would not dare to cross. And it is precisely this contrast that makes the story so powerful. While everything indicated that there was no more hope, a dog decided to act, following only instinct and a heart willing to save. Imagine the scene, the snow covering everything, the heavy silence interrupted only by the distant noise of the searches, which were already beginning to subside. Experienced professionals, exhausted, convinced that there was no more chance to find signs of life. And then he appears, an ordinary dog without a uniform, without equipment, but with an unshakable determination. Have you ever been through this? That feeling that even when everyone has already given up, something inside you insists on believing? That's what makes this story so impactful, because we are not just talking about animal instinct, but about an act of heroism that echoes as a lesson to us all. And maybe you've heard of hero dogs, those who get into fires, save people from drowning, or find victims in rubble. But each time a new account emerges, the feeling is the same. How can such a loyal and seemingly simple being carry such greatness? Stay with me until the end, because what you will discover now may surprise you, and a lot. This dog did not just find the child. He refused to stop, even when everything around indicated that there was no chance. And here is a curious detail. The experts who later analyzed the situation came to the conclusion that if it were not for his stubbornness, the outcome would have been completely different. Now think a little. How many times does life put before us situations in which giving up seems the most logical path? The cold of uncertainty, the weight of tiredness, the silence of loneliness. But then a spark arises, something that pushes us to continue, even without guarantees. It is as if this story of the dog in the snow is also a mirror of many human battles, those that we fight in silence without an audience, with only hope as a guide. And that is exactly why it excites so much, because deep down each of us sees ourselves in that moment of choice between giving up or insisting. The most impressive thing is that while the firefighters were already collecting their equipment, he kept digging. Every move, every dig in the snow was an act of faith. And with each passing moment, the scene became more improbable until the moment hope won. How would you feel to witness something like that? And more, what would you do if you were in his place, surrounded by difficulties, not sure that it is worth following? Questions like these are part of the impact of this story, because it speaks not just of a rescue, but of a living example of determination, loyalty, and unconditional love. And before you think you've grasped the full force of this narrative, it's important to say, this is just the gateway. What follows is even more intense, full of details that will make you see dogs and even life in a different way. So take a deep breath, settle in well, and get ready, because the next part of this story is one of those that are forever etched in memory. And perhaps listening to this story, some memory has awakened in you. It may be a time when you felt all was lost, and yet something inside you insisted on continuing. Or maybe it's that memory of a pet who did something amazing, showing a loyalty that words cannot describe. If this topic makes sense to you, leave here in the comments what touched you the most so far. I will love reading each experience, each opinion, because it is in this exchange that we realize that we are not alone, that these stories echo in many people, in different but equally profound ways. And look, if you are feeling this connection now, take the opportunity to leave your like. It sounds simple, but it makes all the difference. It's like a sign that this message has really reached you. And when you like the video, YouTube itself understands that this content has value and helps bring that message to even more people who need to hear it. And of course, if this kind of story awakens something in you, hope, inspiration, or even that desire to look at animals with even more admiration, subscribe to the channel. This way you guarantee that you will be together in the next narratives, following every detail of these stories of courage and love that cannot be forgotten. Your participation here is what makes this space grow, become more and more a community united by emotion, empathy, and that certainty that there are moments that really transform. Now back to the scene. While everyone had already lost faith, That dog wouldn't stop. The city seemed to have been swallowed by an icy silence. The streets, once bustling, were now buried by thick layers of snow that grew by the hour. It was as if nature itself had decided to impose a cruel test on that small place in the United States. The wind blew with a cutting force, pushing dense flakes that erased any trace of footprints or tracks. The windows of the houses shook, the lampposts bent under the weight of the accumulated ice, and the feeling was that time had stopped. Those who looked outside saw only an endless white cloak, as if the whole city had been torn off the map. The cold wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It went through the bones and froze hope. Residents were in seclusion, trying to keep warm amid the constant noise of the wind, which seemed to whisper hidden truths about the fragility of life. With each new bulletin, the news spread. The child was missing. One mistake in timing, one oversight amid the chaos of the blizzard, and suddenly an entire family has been thrown into the worst nightmare imaginable. It was as if every second that passed was a blow against hope, an uneven race between time and survival. Firefighters, experienced in rescues, were faced with a scenario that even the best equipment could not cope with. The blocked streets made quick access impossible, vehicles jammed at strategic points, and the intense cold put even rescuers at risk. Nevertheless, teams were organized. Flashlights cut through the darkness of night. Trained dogs sniffed out nothingness amid the snow, and the radio crackled with increasingly tense messages. The whole city followed in silence, with its heart stuck in its throat. At that moment, something curious began to happen behind the scenes of the community. People who spoke little to each other united. Neighbors offered to open paths, others lit bonfires at strategic points to guide groups, and even strangers joined in a makeshift aid network. It was as if the tragedy had revealed the true essence of that people. In the face of pain, there were no more divisions, only the decision to fight together against the relentless force of nature. This silent union was one of the most impactful marks of this journey, because it showed that even in the midst of chaos, there is a spark of humanity that insists on shining. Meanwhile, in the home of the child's family, the mood was one of pure despair. The exhausted mother could not get the image of her son smiling hours before out of her mind. The father, with trembling hands, tried to maintain a firm posture, but his red eyes delivered the truth. He too was on the verge of collapse. Every knock on the door, every noise on the radio, was a hope that came and went. There were no explanations, only questions that echoed in the void. How could this happen? Why just now, in this unforgiving cold? And it was in this scenario that an unlikely figure emerged. The dog, which until then had looked like just another animal in the crowd, began to stir. It sniffed the wind, dug small dots out of the snow, barked as if to say something humans couldn't understand. Some ignored it, believing that it was just a reflection of instinct. But those who watched closely noticed that there was an unusual determination there. It was as if that dog had picked up an invisible signal, a direction that no one else could see. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because it is precisely in these details that the most striking revelations lie. It was not just a disappearance nor an ordinary blizzard. It was a battle against time, against despair, and against human limitations. The impact of it all was beyond what the eye could see. Behind the scenes of that frosty night, decisions were being made that could completely change the outcome. The mindset of each person involved would be tested, from firefighters who had to choose where to focus efforts, to family members struggling not to indulge in panic. And when we talk about choices, we are also talking about transformation, because it is in these extreme moments that unexpected revelations arise. Tragedy, however cruel, forces everyone to look within and discover strengths they never imagined they had. It is as if the snow, cold and unforgiving, is also a mirror of life, covering everything with uncertainty, but hiding under it the truth that only comes to light when someone insists on digging. This dog, seemingly fragile in the face of such a brutal blizzard, began to become the center of attention, not because anyone had asked, but because his attitude defied logic. As machines jammed and radios failed, he simply followed instinct. And this instinct, which many underestimate, ended up revealing something essential. Sometimes the strength to change the course of a story does not come from the most sophisticated resources, but from the simple courage not to give up. And it's impossible not to think how much this scene reflects our own journey. How many times do we find ourselves surrounded by obstacles, without visibility, without clear direction, and yet we have to choose between stopping or moving forward? This narrative is not only about a city frozen by the cold, but about how every decision, every gesture, can have a much greater impact than we imagine. Because deep down there is always a way out, and it often appears in the most unexpected places. What began as a desperate search by firefighters and volunteers turned into a real lesson in persistence. The hours passed, the snow gave no respite, and the tension increased every moment. But that dog wouldn't stop. His every move seemed to carry a silent message, as if to say, there is still a chance. And this chance, as unlikely as it was, rekindled something in the heart of the entire community. And at this point, I want to invite you. Comment there. This makes sense to me. I want to know if this story also makes you reflect on how life in the midst of chaos can bring hidden lessons. Because when we share these insights, we not only strengthen our own journey, but we help spread that flame of hope that is so lacking in the world. The news of the disappearance spread like lightning through the small town. In the midst of the storm that had already paralyzed everything, the information that a child had disappeared fell on the residents like an unbearable weight. It was hard to believe that in such a hostile environment, someone so fragile could hold out for a long time. The clock turned on the enemy. Every minute dragged hope lower, and yet no one was willing to give up. The sirens of the firefighters broke the silence of the dawn. The voices on the radio broadcast quick orders, but what hung over everyone was the same question. Was there still a chance? Inside the house, the scene was heartbreaking. The mother, almost without strength, clutched a blanket as if it were the last connection with her son. Her eyes fixed on the door showed that with every noise coming from the street, she still believed that it could be him coming back. The father tried to keep control, talking to the firefighters, repeating details, as if in each sentence a new clue could arise. It was a stark portrait of human vulnerability in the face of life's unpredictability. And there, behind the scenes of this pain, something much greater was being drawn. The strength of a community united by the same cause. Searches began immediately, but conditions were almost impossible. Lanterns could not cut through the thick snow, radios failed from the interference of the storm, and every step seemed to be swallowed by an endless white. Firefighters, police and volunteers divided into groups, marking areas with makeshift ribbons, trying to create a method amid the chaos. It was like looking for a needle in a frozen haystack, but everyone knew they couldn't stop. With each transmitted order, with each open map on the hood of a car, the same idea was present. Perhaps it was only a fraction of hope, but still, it was hope. And in this dark scenario, there were also small revelations. People who once barely spoke to each other were now side by side, digging, illuminating, opening paths. Every single gesture had a huge impact. There were those who offered hot tea to the volunteers, those who lent extra clothes to warm those at the front, those who sheltered families who could not return to their homes. This hidden truth of tragedy showed something that we often forget. In the face of pain, a collective transformation arises. That intense cold, which seemed to freeze even thoughts, was also thawing hearts hardened by time. Meanwhile, the figure of the dog gained more strength. He was not in the official teams, he had no training, but there was something in his behavior that attracted attention. He sniffed from side to side, strode against the wind as if he were sure of a path. Many doubted, they thought it was just unrest, but his insistence became impossible to ignore. It was as if, in the midst of the storm, he had access to an invisible compass. A decision loomed before everyone: follow the traditional logic or risk relying on something that no one could explain. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because this is precisely where the essence of this journey lies. It wasn't just the disappearance of a child, it was the clash between human limitation and the possibility of something greater. How many times in life do we come across situations when the right path seems inaccessible, where all options seem closed? In these moments, what defines the outcome is not only the resources we have, but the mindset we choose to adopt. The community of that city was facing a brutal test: give in to despair or keep the flame of the search alive, even without guarantees. And there is one detail that cannot be ignored. The missing child symbolized more than an individual. It represented the future, continuity, life in its most fragile form. That is why the mobilization was so intense. It was not just about finding someone, but proving to themselves that they were still capable of fighting adversity. This psychological impact was a powerful fuel, which kept the volunteers steady even when their feet hurt, their hands bled, and their bodies cried out for rest. The most curious thing is that while many were guided by cold calculations of probability, the dog moved out of pure conviction. He did not have maps, did not listen to orders, did not read reports. I just kept going. And this attitude defied all established parameters. It was as if he was the embodiment of faith in motion, a reminder that sometimes the hidden truth lies precisely in what seems irrational, but which deep down carries a greater logic than we can understand at that moment. The wind increased, the snow covered the lanterns, but each look turned to the same point, where the dog was going. And here an inevitable reflection arises. How many times do we ignore signals because we are too caught up in our own certainties? How often do we fail to follow an instinct for fear of appearing illogical? This story, still under construction at that time, shows us that the most transformative decisions are often born of unlikely choices. The firefighters began to follow his movements almost silently, as if they did not want to admit that they were relying on something non-standard. But with each step, with each improvised dig in the snow, a different hope was born. It was as if that animal was revealing with its gestures that there was still a thread of life pulsing somewhere. The tension was unbearable, but at the same time there was something inspiring happening before everyone's eyes. And so, in the midst of the storm, the disappearance went from being just a tragedy to becoming a journey of revelations. Not just about the resilience of a lost child, but about the ability of an entire community to reinvent itself. Because there, each one was being tested. It was more than a physical search, it was an inner search, a struggle against one's own limit. He said, "I'm on this journey too. I want to see who feels, along with me, that this story goes far beyond the snow and cold, because it speaks directly about us, about decisions, courage, and the impact that unlikely choices can have." The next few hours were a real test of endurance. With each passing minute, the blizzard seemed to gain even more strength, as if it wanted to defy any human attempt to overcome it. Rescuers scattered in different directions, firefighters dug with improvised shovels, volunteers formed human chains to cover more territory, but Snow White swallowed up all efforts. The radio, which was supposed to be an ally, carried only short messages, broken by the hiss of interference, and what was once hope has been transformed into a heavy silence, that kind of silence that speaks more than any words. The cold wasn't just physical, he penetrated the soul of everyone who was there as if he wanted to steal faith. The wind punished the face, burned the skin, froze even the thought. Many were already quietly wondering whether it would be worth continuing, whether there was still any real chance to find the child alive. But no one dared to say it out loud, because to admit this would be like declaring defeat in the face of an implacable enemy. The whole community seemed suspended between hope and despair, and this duality was almost unbearable. Inside the makeshift base of operations, the atmosphere was even more tense. Scribbled maps with red markings, incomplete reports, coordinates that were lost amid the chaos. Men and women looked at each other, trying to convey strength, but their eyes betrayed doubt. It was as if everyone was faced with a hidden truth, that the more time passed, the smaller the chances, and yet there was a quiet stubbornness that kept them from giving up. This collective obstinacy was what kept the movement going amid the chaos. As the hours dragged on, the temperature plummeted cruelly. Thermometers marked frightening numbers, capable of paralyzing even the most prepared body. Each breath came out in white clouds that quickly disappeared into the frozen air. The gloves no longer protected the fingers. The feet ached, even inside the reinforced boots. And despite all the physical exertion, the feeling was that they were just spinning in circles. The search until that moment seemed to have no end, and the silence in response to each call echoed like a punch to the heart. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because what was happening there goes far beyond a rescue operation. It was a real psychological journey, an internal clash of each volunteer against his own limits. It wasn't just the fight against the snow, against the cold, or against the weather. It was also against the internal voices that shouted, "It's not going to work out." And at times like this, what keeps someone on their feet is not just physical strength, but mentality, the almost irrational belief that even when all seems lost, there is still a way out. Behind the scenes, some conversations revealed the emotional weight no one wanted to admit. There were firefighters who remembered other searches without a happy ending, bringing up painful memories. There were volunteers who wondered what they would say to the family if the worst happened. And above all, there was a collective fear that that small town would be forever scarred by irreparable loss. This shadow of failure was almost as strong as the storm. But paradoxically, it was also what impelled everyone to continue, because to give up would be to sign the sentence of defeat. Some men fell to their knees in the snow, exhausted, needing to be lifted by others. Women who had gone out as volunteers to illuminate stretches of road now held lanterns with trembling hands. It was a scenario that seemed to border on the human limit, but every look exchanged between them reinforced the same silent decision. No one would return home as long as there was a thread of chance. This implicit pact was the invisible glue that held the community together at that time. In the midst of this suffocating scenario, the dog followed with its enigmatic determination. While humans got lost in calculations, he simply moved forward, sniffed, dug, and more people began to look at him as a symbol, a spark of faith that resisted logic. The impact of this detail was enormous. It was not just an animal in action, but a living reminder that life has mysterious ways of manifesting itself. A truth that is not always seen in reports or statistics, but that is present in the simplest gestures. Hours passed like days. The sky darkened, the night came heavy, and the snow gave no respite. Some had to be withdrawn out of exhaustion, replaced by new volunteers who arrived with the same mixture of fear and courage. And even in the face of exhaustion, there was something transformative going on. That unsuccessful search was not only revealing the harshness of the tragedy, but also the depth of human solidarity. Every step taken on the ice was also a step toward a new understanding of what really matters. And here is the most curious point. The greater the sense of despair, the stronger the bond between those people. It was as if collective pain had the power to unite unknowns around a common purpose. The tragedy, with all its devastating impact, was showing the essence of humanity, the ability to connect, to share, to not abandon the other, even when everything seems meaningless. This revelation was undoubtedly one of the most powerful marks of that night, but that wasn't all. Behind the scenes, there were also small scenes that are rarely remembered in official accounts, but which carry a deep meaning. A firefighter offering his coat to a volunteer who was shivering from the cold. A lady preparing liters of tea and coffee at home and taking it by car to the support point, taking risks on the frozen streets. Young people who, instead of retiring, improvised torches with pieces of cloth soaked in alcohol to illuminate dark stretches. It is these small revelations that show how, in the midst of adversity, a collective transformation is born. And as the clock ticked mercilessly forward, the question hung over everyone. Was there still hope? No one had the answer, but everyone knew that there was still something to be done. No matter if the search seemed in vain, there was an invisible force that pushed them to follow. Because deep down, each one understood that to give up would be to carry an unbearable weight for the rest of their lives. And that awareness is what kept the lanterns burning, the voices calling in the wind, and the hands digging endlessly. The city, until then plunged into the icy silence of tragedy, was beginning to rediscover itself as a community. The emotional impact of that moment was shaping new connections, rebuilding forgotten bonds, and bringing to light the truth that, in the end, we are defined by the choices we make in the face of difficulty. And this journey, marked by cold, fear, and uncertainty, was just beginning to reveal its deepest layers. He writes, "That makes sense to me. I want to know who also realizes how much this story, even on its darkest side, reveals a journey of courage, choices, and transformation." Night had already overtaken the city, and the snow continued to fall mercilessly, covering even the traces of the previous searches. The volunteers, already exhausted, seemed to be fighting an invisible enemy. The cold burned inside, and the feeling of helplessness became more and more difficult to bear. It was in this scenario of almost giving up that an unexpected presence began to catch everyone's attention: the family dog. He had initially stayed indoors, sheltered, but seemed unable to settle for the child's absence. In an almost instinctive movement, he broke through the barriers that held him and advanced towards the snow, sniffing with intensity, as if he had been given a mission that only he could fulfill. The scene was as sudden as it was striking. The animal, of medium size but with a firm and attentive look, launched itself into the icy darkness as if it had no doubt what it was doing. There was no hesitation, no fear, just an unwavering determination. While many humans already showed signs of exhaustion, the dog showed renewed, almost inexhaustible energy. With each movement of the muzzle against the snow, with each firm digging of its paws, a silent message seemed to be transmitted. There was still something to be found. At first, some watched with suspicion. There were those who believed that it was just instinct, a natural reaction to smell or movement. But as the minutes turned into hours, the dog's insistence began to elicit respect. He did not deviate. He did not give up. He did not allow himself to be knocked down by the intensity of the storm. His panting breath, mixed with the white vapor that was lost in the icy air, was the portrait of resistance. Little by little, everyone stopped to observe him, as if he were revealing himself to be an unexpected protagonist of that tragedy. The most impactful thing was to notice how the collective mentality began to change in the face of the determination of the animal. Until recently, the mood was one of resignation, an almost unbearable weight of frustration and fear. But the simple act of watching him fight so hard brought a spark of transformation. People began to rearrange themselves, to follow in his footsteps, to dig where he insisted. There was no official order for this, no planned strategy. It was as if the leadership had suddenly changed hands, or rather passed into the paws of that dog. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because what was happening there was much more than just an animal instinct. It was a hidden truth about the power of loyalty and silent faith. While rational calculations already pointed to the worst, that dog showed that there is a dimension to life that cannot be measured by numbers or probabilities. His presence was a living reminder that amid the chaos, there are still invisible forces capable of moving mountains, or in this case, of digging tirelessly in the snow until they find what everyone thought was impossible. The scenes from that moment revealed a stark contrast. On one side, volunteers with dimly lit lanterns, tired faces, bodies almost surrendered to the cold. On the other, an animal that, without words, conveyed courage, firmness, and purpose. This comparison made clear a powerful psychological impact. If he was unwilling to give up, how could humans give up? This revelation, so simple and so strong, was like a breath of renewed energy in every heart present in that search. With every firm bark, with every dig, the feeling was that something was about to happen. Some firefighters approached, began to support, removing snow from the same point indicated by the dog. Other volunteers followed suit, expanding the area, organizing again as if a forgotten hope had been reactivated. It was as if the storm itself had lost for a moment the power to destabilize that community. The determination of a single animal had restored the mentality of an entire group. And here there is a revelation that deserves attention. We often believe that the protagonists of great stories need to be those with the greatest resources, with preparation, with titles, but the truth is that the most profound impact can come from where you least expect it. The family dog, moved only by loyalty and love, showed that unlikely decisions can carry the power to transform not just a moment, but a whole journey. This collective transformation began to gain momentum, and the city, once immersed in silence and fear, now echoed a new rhythm of hope. People's eyes were fixed on him. It was like watching a flame that, against all odds, refused to go out. In every thrilled look, there was the same unspoken question: can he really lead us to the child? And although no one had the courage to answer, everyone was already prepared to follow wherever he went. That quiet confidence, born of watching their delivery, was what kept the groups moving, even as the bodies begged for rest. And the most fascinating thing is to realize the invisible impact of this scene. It wasn't just the search for a missing child. It was the awakening of something deep in each person present, the rediscovery of one's own courage, the reminder that life requires faith even when all seems lost. The dog had become more than a guide. He was now a symbol of resistance, living proof that transformation can be born from the simplest gestures. Over time, his figure began to be closely followed by everyone, as if his every step was a revelation, a map drawn by instinct and loyalty. There were no speeches, no detailed plans, only the quiet certainty that he knew where to go. And this silence, paradoxically, was more convincing than any words. The rescue journey had just gained a new protagonist. And the most curious thing is that he did not have to say anything, he did not have to ask for confidence. It was enough to act. The force of action often speaks louder than any speech, and at that moment everyone knew that the course of history was beginning to change. He says, "I'm on this journey too. I want to see who feels, along with me, that the appearance of this loyal dog was not just a detail, but a watershed in this narrative of courage, determination, and faith." The tension that night had already exceeded all limits of the bearable, but what was about to happen would forever mark the memory of every person present. The dog, now officially the protagonist of that search, seemed to ignore the pain, the cold, and the tiredness. With his paws already injured by the stiffness of the snow and contact with the cutting ice, he continued to dig, tirelessly repeating the movement, as if there was a secret compass inside him that pointed to the exact place where they should insist. The panting breath mingled with the noise of the wind, creating an irregular symphony that, to those who watched, seemed more like a call of life against death. Each dig of the animal was accompanied by attentive, almost incredulous looks. Firefighters, volunteers, and family members stood motionless for a few seconds, as if faced with a scene impossible to explain. There was no map, no technology, only the pure instinct of a being moved by loyalty. It was impossible not to wonder in silence, was he really on the right track? This doubt became a kind of collective suspense, a thread of tension that united everyone there in expectation. The cold, which had already overcome so many that night, seemed not to exist for the dog. Thick flakes of snow piled up on his back, clinging to the damp fur, but nothing stopped him. He dug furiously, as one who fights against time, against one's own destiny. At certain moments, when I stopped for a second to sniff, the silence around me was absolute, almost suffocating. Everyone held their breath, waiting for a sign, a hint, any revelation that could turn that search into a rescue. And what was most striking was the contrast. While humans were stuck in rational calculations, trying to cope with the weight of hopelessness, the dog did not do the math, did not project probabilities. He just kept going. This simple, almost primitive decision carried a hidden truth. Life often requires total surrender, even without guarantees. His mentality, if you can call it that, was not to give in, and that in itself was a shock of transformation to those watching. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is a powerful metaphor here about choices and determination. Think about how often, in the face of difficulties, our first reaction is to stop, retreat, or simply give up. Logic always seems to dictate. There is nothing else to do. But this dog almost poetically shows us the opposite. It reveals that seemingly irrational decisions can carry the greatest impact. While everyone wondered if there was still a chance, he acted as if the answer was obvious. Yes, there still is. This silent revelation stirred every heart present in that scene. Every minute the tension grew. The wind howled like a cruel reminder that time was the enemy. Lanterns swayed, creating quivering shadows over the dug snow. The human hands, no longer strong, only tried to follow his movements, removing blocks of ice where he indicated. It was as if leadership had really shifted, and everyone now submitted to the authority of an instinct that seemed greater than any logic. Behind the scenes, the psychological impact was immense. The child's father, once motionless and overcome by despair, now walked back and forth, muttering disconnected phrases, as if trying to convince himself that there was hope. The mother, wrapped in a blanket, could not take her eyes off the dog, as if the last chance to meet her son was deposited in it. Firefighters exchanged looks that said more than words. If he stops, it's over. But he wouldn't stop. And the more he dug, the clearer the size of his delivery became. The paws were red, some nails broken by the effort, but the animal did not even hesitate. The cold that paralyzed humans seemed only to intensify their resolve. It was as if his body no longer obeyed the ordinary rules of nature, but only the inner call of loyalty. This insistence was both distressing and inspiring. Distressing because it revealed the physical limit he was willing to push. Inspiring because it showed that in the face of adversity, it is still possible to go further. And there was one detail that no one could ignore. The dog was not distracted. While humans lost themselves in conversations, calculations, or painful memories, he remained focused, fixed, almost obsessed. This absolute concentration was what kept the flame burning in everyone around, because deep down, watching him continue, people understood that giving up was not an option. And that collective understanding was perhaps the greatest transformation that night had produced. Some firefighters, already calloused by years of service, muttered among themselves that they had never witnessed anything like it. Volunteers moved closer and closer, forming an almost ritualistic circle around the dog. There was no shouting, there was no confusion, only the constant sound of paws cutting through the snow and the wind roaring in response. It was as if the universe had reduced all its complexity to a single scene, an animal digging against its own impossibility. And every moment the tension built up. People knew that if nothing was found, the impact would be devastating. But at the same time, there was a silent teaching there. To continue even when everything seems to say otherwise is already, in itself, a victory. This lesson was etched in the mind of each one present as a deep mark. The scene continued at a hypnotic pace. Dig after dig, silence after silence, time seemed to lengthen, as if every second was a test of faith. And the most curious thing is that the more improbable it seemed, the stronger became the invisible trust that everyone had in him. The question, is he on the right track? It stopped being a question and turned into a cheer. Everyone wanted to believe, and believing in that moment was as vital as breathing. And it must be recognized, there was something transcendental in that scene. The dog's instinct had become a symbol. It represented not only an animal's search for someone it loved, but the very human struggle for survival, faith, and overcoming. It was as if in that repetitive and obstinate act was contained a truth about life. No matter how impossible it seems, there is always a chance as long as one refuses to give up. The rescue journey was entering a new phase. It was no longer just about men against the snow, but about the fusion between reason and instinct, between calculation and faith, between despair and hope. The dog, with its wounded paws and exhausted body, had become the ultimate symbol of resistance. And everyone knew that somehow it couldn't be in vain. He said, "That makes sense to me. I want to know who realizes, as I do, that this scene is more than just a dog digging in the snow. It's a living lesson in courage, surrender, and the invisible strength that is born when you decide not to give up." The snow continued to fall relentlessly, covering the tracks of the night as if to erase any trace of hope. But in the midst of absolute white, a force insisted on resisting. The dog. After hours of digging without stopping, already with an exhausted body and injured paws, something changed in his posture. He began to bark with a different intensity, a desperate sound, but at the same time charged with conviction. It was not just a cry for help, it was a call, almost as if to say in his own language, "Here it is, come quickly." The barking echoed through the snow-covered field, cutting off the wind, and immediately made everyone move. Firefighters and volunteers quickly approached, faces tense, eyes wide, trying to believe there was a real reason for that reaction. The lanterns all turned to the spot the dog was digging, illuminating the jagged hole opened by the insistence of his paws. The animal did not stop, now more agitated than ever, as if every second was precious. And it was at that moment that the first signs appeared. An object partially covered by snow, a small piece of children's clothing, rigid by the ice, but unmistakable. The impossible was beginning to become reality. The impact was immediate. Everyone's heart raced. Hands that had previously trembled from the cold now trembled from adrenaline. The child's mother, upon seeing the fragment of what appeared to be her son's clothes, let out a muffled cry that mixed despair and hope. The father ran towards the group, but was restrained by firefighters, who knew that every move needed to be calculated so as not to put everything at risk. The tension was so dense that it seemed material, as if it could be cut with your own hands. And in that scenario, the dog wouldn't stop barking, as if demanding that humans do their part. It was like saying, "I brought you here, now finish what I started." This scene, witnessed by all, carried a hidden truth of enormous impact. Sometimes the answer comes from where we least expect it, and it is up to us to believe it. The entire community, until then dominated by a sense of defeat, was now faced with a revelation that changed everything. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is a powerful metaphor here about journeys and transformations. Think about life. How often do we face long periods of darkness, of seemingly futile efforts, of attempts that seemed to lead nowhere. And suddenly, after insisting for longer than we thought we were capable of, something happens. A loophole, a sign, a little evidence that we were not digging in vain. This scene of the dog barking desperately in the snow is the living portrait of this turning point. Firefighters began digging with an energy they hadn't had in hours. Shovels moved, hands worked, lanterns illuminated each piece of ice that was taken out. The dog, even exhausted, did not move away, remained glued to the hole as if protecting that sacred space. And with each layer of snow removed, it became clearer. There was something there. A space formed under the snow, like a small air bubble, an unlikely shelter from the deadly cold. It was a revelation that no one dared to foresee, but that was before everyone. The voices became firmer. The pace of excavations accelerated. Fear gave way to adrenaline and exhaustion disappeared, replaced by an inexplicable collective force. It was as if the entire city had been reborn in that instant, focusing its energy on a single point: saving the child. The scene carried such a deep emotional weight that some volunteers let tears run down, even without knowing the outcome yet. Because at that moment, it was no longer just a search. It was the materialization of hope, the living proof that faith can resist even the most implacable ice. And what makes it all the more grandiose is realizing the role of the dog in this process. He not only found the point, he kept the flame alive in all hearts when the darkness seemed definitive. Their determination was the spark of transformation, the trigger that drove men and women to keep digging. This truth, often ignored, is the essence of life. It is not always the strongest or the most prepared who create the miracles, but the most persistent. The noise of shovels against the ice intensified, accompanied by the incessant barking of the dog. The circle of people around increased, each wanting to see up close the miracle unfolding before their eyes. With each patch of snow removed, hope grew. The mother, with her hands on her face, murmured prayers without stopping. The father, motionless now, kept his eyes fixed on the hole, as if he could not blink for fear of missing the decisive moment. And then, one of the firefighters let out a cry of surprise. There was movement under the snow. Small, barely noticeable, but enough to set everyone's heart racing. The dog, as if confirming, barked even louder, howling into the wind as if announcing to the world that the fight had not been in vain. The impossible was becoming palpable. This moment was not only the beginning of a rescue, but also a watershed moment in the mentality of everyone there. The revelation was not just physical finding signs of the child, but symbolic, proving that even against all odds, there is still room for the miracle. This scene turned into a reminder that the impact of perseverance can be greater than any human calculation. And most importantly, that discovery didn't just bring relief. It also brought the certainty that every gesture, every step, every seemingly useless dig had contributed to getting there. It was as if the whole journey had been worth it, because it showed that the hidden truth of life is not only in the final result, but in the path, in the decision not to stop. He says, "I'm on this journey too. I want to see who understands, as I do, that this moment is not just about finding a child, but about understanding the invisible force that is born when persistence and faith meet on the same path." The hole in the snow turned every second into a portal to the impossible. Firefighters, volunteers, and even ordinary residents who came up worked side by side, removing blocks of ice with their bare hands, not caring about the pain that the cold caused. The dog's bark had been the trigger, and now each movement was driven by a collective force that came not just from the muscles but from the heart. The silence that had once dominated the search dissolved into sounds of shoveling, coordinating voices, and panting breaths filled with anxiety. The heavy night air seemed to hold time, and then, amid the absolute white, a detail emerged. A small arm, stiffened by the snow but alive. The shock was immediate. Shouts of warning spread, calling everyone to focus on that point. The lanterns were urgently directed, illuminating the partially buried body. The scene was at once desperate and miraculous. The child was there, immersed in the ice, fragile as a flame about to go out, but there was a subtle movement in his chest. She was breathing. Though weak, though in unimaginable conditions, she breathed. And that almost invisible breath of life became the fuel that ignited the courage of everyone present. The rescuers threw themselves against time. An experienced firefighter, with steady hands despite the cold, plucked the snow carefully, fearing to cause even more damage. Another was already preparing thermal blankets, while volunteers shouted for hot water and first aid equipment. It was as if everyone had been taken by the same mentality. Nothing mattered but keeping that child alive. And the most impressive thing was the energy that dominated the place. The fatigue that once weighed like lead seemed to have disappeared. Adrenaline turned fear into courage and anguish into action. The dog, exhausted, sat for a moment next to him, but did not look away. His fixed eyes conveyed something almost human, the certainty that he had fulfilled his mission. He was panting, covered in snow, his body shivering from the cold, but it was impossible not to notice the glow of triumph that emanated from his posture. It was like saying, "I knew it, he was here, I would never have stopped." And that silent figure beside the ransom became even more symbolic, living proof that loyalty and determination are capable of producing miracles. The child was finally pulled out. Silence settled in for a brief moment, as if everyone held their breath in unison. And then, a sound that echoed like the most anticipated song that night. A faint but unmistakable cry. The collective heart exploded. Tears flowed from the hardened faces of the firefighters. Volunteers hugged each other, cries of relief cut through the wind. It was as if the whole city had woken up from a nightmare. The cry of the child, even weak, was the melody that returned color to the white of the storm. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because what happened at that instant goes beyond a rescue. It is the materialization of the impact that a united community can have. It is the revelation that the hidden truth behind tragedies is always the same. Life insists. Against the cold, against the weather, against the statistics, there is always a loophole for the unlikely to happen. The transformation that took place there was not only in the body of that child, but in the spirit of each person who witnessed the miracle. They had been reminded that collective decisions, driven by faith and courage, can alter even the cruelest fate. The backstage of that moment is equally powerful. While makeshift doctors wrapped the child in layers of warmth, the mother's eyes filled with an indescribable glow. The father, kneeling, could not stop touching his son, quietly repeating words of thanks. And there, in the snow, there were no more strangers. All were part of the same story. All had participated in a miracle that would never be forgotten. Each carried with them the certainty that there was something greater guiding that outcome. The dog was hugged by volunteers, stroked with tears in his eyes, treated as the real hero of the evening. He did not understand the compliments. He did not understand the words, but he felt the human warmth, the energy that now turned into celebration. His mission was accomplished, and unbeknownst to him, he had taught everyone there a lesson in mindset and perseverance that would be etched forever. And the most striking thing was to see how the environment had transformed. Where once despair reigned, now there was relief and gratitude. Where once fear was breathed, now victory was breathed. The entire city, represented by that group of rescuers and volunteers, had witnessed a watershed. The impossible is not as absolute as it seems. The rescue was more than physical, it was spiritual. It was confirmation that even in the darkest moments, there is always a flame that insists on staying lit. Some firefighters, already veterans of so many tragedies, hugged each other as if they were children, unable to contain their emotion. Volunteers who barely knew each other shared tears and smiles. There were even those who, in silence, looked at the sky covered with clouds as if thanking for something greater, because it was impossible not to realize that this outcome carried a transcendental dimension. The improbable had become real, and the impact of it would be remembered by all forever. And if we look behind the emotional scenes, we see even more revelations. The rescue was not only of the child. Each person there was also rescued from something invisible, from disbelief, from skepticism, from the idea that nothing else could work. The miracle was not only in the small body that breathed again, but in the collective awakening of an entire community. The journey there had been marked by pain, by cold and by fear, but also by courage, persistence and faith. And it is precisely this fusion of feelings that makes this story so powerful. He says, "I'm on this journey too. I want to see who feels that this rescue is not just the story of a saved child, but a profound reminder about faith, courage, and the invisible force that unites people around the same purpose." The child was now in the arms of the rescue team, wrapped in layers of blankets and human warmth, but none of this compared to the instant when the parents found her again. The mother, with trembling hands, moved forward without thinking about protocols or medical guidelines. She fell to her knees in the snow, hugging her son as if she feared the world might tear him away again. Her crying was a mix of pent-up grief and exploding gratitude. The father, who until then had been trying to stand his ground, collapsed as well. Tears ran down the hardened face, wetting the blanket that covered the child, and each sob seemed to carry the weight of all the hours of despair they had lived. It was as if the heart of both, which until minutes ago had been trapped in the ice, had begun to beat again with force. All around, no one dared interrupt that scene. Firefighters, volunteers, neighbors, and even strangers kept a reverent silence. Some had tears in their eyes, others murmured words of relief, but all shared the same feeling. They were facing something that transcended the simple idea of a rescue. It was more than life preserved. It was proof that the improbable can become reality when faith, courage, and surrender unite in a single direction. Each person there carried within him the realization that he had participated in a journey that would be remembered for decades. The dog, in turn, remained motionless for a few moments, watching the scene with his chest heaving and his eyes fixed. That look, charged with intensity, seemed to understand the dimension of what was happening. He had no words, but his body spoke. It showed exhaustion, it showed pain in his paws, but it also conveyed a kind of serenity, as if to say in silence that his mission was completed. And it was then that looks began to turn to him. First discreet, almost shy, then growing, until everyone was aware that the real hero of that night was the animal that had never given up. People approached one by one. One firefighter, still with tears in his eyes, bent down and ran his hand over the dog's frozen back. The mother, even hugging her son, extended her free arm to caress his head, whispering words between sobs. The father, his voice choked up, said something that echoed loudly among everyone. "If it weren't for him, my son wouldn't be here." And in that instant, the hidden truth that was already hanging in the air took concrete form. The dog wasn't just a supporting character. He was the protagonist, the silent leader who had turned a tragedy into a miracle. The impact of this collective recognition was profound. In a society used to expecting heroes in uniform or titles, seeing an animal take on this role so clearly was a revelation that stirred everyone's mindset. The loyalty, courage, and dedication he had shown were a living lesson, impossible to ignore. There was proof that often the greatest transformations are born of what we think is small or improbable. And there was no way to look at that scene without reflecting on how many times, in our own lives, we ignored signs or invisible forces that could guide us. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because what was before everyone that night was not only the victory of life over death, but also a faithful portrait of the essence of the human journey. How often do we seek complex explanations, rational calculations, or elaborate strategies, when in fact the answer may lie in what is simple and pure? The dog did not make plans, did not draw routes. He just decided not to give up. And this decision, which seemed irrational to human eyes, was precisely the key to the impossible coming true. It's a powerful revelation. Often the most transformative choices come not from the mind, but from the heart. The backstage of this emotion was almost as intense as the main scene. There were volunteers who had lost relatives in similar tragedies, and now felt as if they had regained a piece of what they had lost. There were veteran firefighters who, accustomed to pain and grief, allowed themselves to believe in miracles again. There were children in the neighborhood, protected by blankets, who looked at the dog with glowing eyes, creating in their minds the image of a hero who would never be forgotten. This communion of feelings showed how a single act can generate waves of impact that spread far beyond the instant in which they happen. The intense cold continued, but it seemed to have no more power over those people. Emotional warmth outweighed snow, wind, and fear. The environment had completely changed. Where before there was only suffocating silence and hopelessness, now there were hugs, tears, and an indescribable energy of victory. The transformation was visible in every look, in every gesture, in every word spoken in a low voice. No one could get out of there the way they did. Because witnessing a miracle is something that breaks down internal barriers, that breaks down invisible walls, and that reveals hidden truths about one's own life. and at the center of it all was the dog. He did not understand the greatness of his act as humans did, but he felt it. He felt the affectionate touch, the excited looks, the collective vibration that now surrounded him. For him, it was all loyalty and instinct. But for humans, it had become a watershed, an eternal reminder that heroes don't need cloaks, uniforms, or speeches. Heroes are those who act when everyone has already given up, who move when the world seems paralyzed. The mother, still holding her son, brought her face closer to the dog and, with tears streaming down, said something almost inaudible, but which carried an immense weight. "You saved my life too." Because deep down, it wasn't just the child who had been rescued. It was the whole family. It was hope that had been returned. It was the conviction that the impossible can become reality when there is true surrender. The snow continued to fall, but now it seemed only the backdrop for a scene that would be marked in the collective memory. Each flake that touched the ground felt less cold, less heavy, because it had been overcome by the flame that everyone carried in their hearts. A flame rekindled by the instinct of a dog that refused to stop. And that night, each person present knew that they had been touched by something greater, something that could not be explained by logic alone, but that would be remembered as a testimony to the invisible force that guides certain journeys. Write there, comment there, this makes sense to me. I want to see who sees along with me that this emotion of family is not just the end of a despair, but a revelation about how courage, faith, and loyalty can change entire destinies. The news spread through the city like wildfire on a dry fuse, even though the ground was covered with snow. First, it was the messages exchanged in the group of neighbors, short and tremulous, as if the words needed to confirm their own reality. Found. It's alive. The dog found it. Then local radio stations interrupted programming to report what seemed like a fable narrated in real time. Within minutes, phones began ringing in homes where the clock was already past midnight, and sleepy faces lit up with the same mixture of surprise and relief. The name of the dog crossed the streets, crossed the hot foods that cooled forgotten on the table, entered garages, bakeries, warehouses. The city, which hours before had seemed shrunken by cold and apprehension, now expanded in a murmur of gratitude. What had happened in that makeshift rescue clearing wasn't just a heroic act. It was a declaration that life, when it comes together, wins. At the fire station, the phone wouldn't stop. Reporters wanted details, onlookers asked for confirmation, friends offered to take supplies. In the hospital, where the child was beginning to warm up, professionals exchanged looks that said everything without needing words. And in the heart of the central square, despite the biting wind, people began to leave the house only to see other excited faces and repeat, "It worked out." The windows reflected small groups embracing, and the church turned on the lights as a spontaneous gesture of gratitude. What once seemed like a scene of tragedy turned into a meeting. Every person who listened to the story felt that, in some way, he had also dug a little that snow. It didn't take long for the dog to become the center of conversation. Those who saw him at the rescue described the steadiness of his gaze, the unbelievable concentration, the wounded pause that did not retreat. Those who did not see it imagined it, and in imagination made it even bigger. Within hours, discussions broke out. Someone suggested an official tribute, another proposed a municipal day of gratitude. There was talk of erecting a small bust in the square. It seemed overkill, and at the same time, it didn't. Because it was not a question of raising an animal to a pedestal on a whim, but of recognizing a gesture that tore an entire city out of the ice of hopelessness. The local veterinarian offered free care, traders promised feed for a year, and the elementary school announced it would dedicate the next day's first class to writing letters of thanks. At every corner, a new detail emerged. One teacher said her students asked if heroism smells, because if it does, the dog can smell it. One baker recalled a customer who hours earlier had paid for 2 coffees and left one for whoever arrived later, as if sensing that the evening would require double the heat. A teenager filmed from afar the arrival of the dog at the makeshift shelter, and when posting the video wrote only "loyalty." The word so simple became an informal title for all that. And suddenly it became clear that the tribute would not only be to the animal, but to what it ignited. The possibility of believing when the odds tell you to give up. City Hall opened its doors even after hours, and the mayor's office was filled with people. Firefighters, volunteers, neighbors. There was no strict protocol, no rehearsed speeches. There was strong coffee, hanging coats and hands that were still shaking. Decisions were made there in the improvisation that usually accompanies true moments. There would be a simple ceremony in the square, a public thanksgiving that would not erase the pain of the night, but turn it into a pact, the commitment to take care of each other, to recognize where silent courage lives. The idea of a medal for the dog took shape, not as an ornament but as a symbol. It would be a necklace with an engraved nameplate, with his name and a short phrase that fit on the metal but expanded in the hearts. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the repercussion we have seen is not just noise after silence, it is transformation. These moments show how much the collective mentality changes when a hidden truth comes to light, that the hero does not always wear a uniform, sometimes he walks on all fours and acts without speech. The impact of this is immense, because it educates without anyone noticing that they are being educated. Children learn with wide eyes the value of persistence. Adults remember with a twinge of shame and a shy smile how many times they have almost given up for less. Tributes, when they are sincere, do not serve to adorn the past, but to guide future decisions. That's why a whole city moved, not for show but for understanding. Behind the scenes, the parallel stories multiplied. A neighbor came home and found in the refrigerator a note left by his wife. "I returned to the square, I can't stay away from people today." Another texted the brother he hadn't spoken to in months, and the reconciliation happened so naturally it seemed rehearsed. A lady locked in the house for days went out to take a blanket to the shelter of the volunteers and, seeing the dog up close, cried an ancient cry, as if his courage had dug a cave inside her too. These discreet revelations are what really sustain a community, because they don't depend on spotlight, they depend on truth. The next morning the city woke up earlier than usual. There was ice on the windowsill, but something warmed inside. The local radio played calm music and between songs told pieces of what had happened, collecting short testimonies, sewing voices into a single fabric. At school the children took drawings, the dog in front of a snowdrift, the dog in a superhero cape, the teachers smiled, let it pass, the dog lying next to the child now with rosy cheeks. In front of the bakery, someone positioned a decorated cardboard box, letters to the hero. People wrote without thinking about style or grammar, like someone who leaves a piece of their heart in the form of ink. When the dog arrived at the square for the small tribute, the murmur fell silent in an instant. There was no high stage, no cordon. There was a semicircle of attentive faces, wet smiles and an air of simple reverence. The veterinarian quickly examined the paws, applied a discreet bandage, and the mayor, in a less firm voice than he had imagined, fastened on the collar the little tag that the whole city already knew by heart. The reading was short, almost a whisper to fit the humility of the moment. Loyalty is courage in silence. The applause that followed wasn't euphoria, it was recognition. The whole city, for a second, seemed to breathe in the same rhythm. And it is curious how the celebration, when it is born from the right place, does not inflate the ego, but widens the sense of responsibility. More than calling the dog a hero, people began to wonder how they could honor that gesture in everyday life. Visiting the elderly neighbor who lives alone, bringing soup to the family who lost their job, not turning their faces to the pain that sometimes passes hurriedly on the sidewalk. The medal on the dog's collar served as a mirror. It reflected in humans what they most wanted to find in themselves. Heroism has gone from being a newspaper statistic to becoming a possible habit. As evening fell, the ice on the sidewalks shone like small lamps. In front of the doors, candles were lit without matching, an impromptu choreography that the whole city seemed to know. The child, still under observation, sent from the ward a drawing made with crayons. He and the dog, holding hands and paws, walking on a snowless street. The drawing was placed in the center of the square, hanging on a rope next to scraps. With each message added, it was as if a layer of cold rolled off the air. And if someone asked what was the exact moment when the dog became a hero, many would answer, it was not when he found the child. That's when it reminded us who we are when we choose not to give up. The repercussion continued, but without excessive noise. An outside journalist arrived and tried to turn the story into a product, but the brilliance of the city was elsewhere, in the small gestures that for days multiplied. The grocery store announced that it would leave a shelf of food at no cost to those in need. The neighborhood club opened its doors to shelter families during the upcoming storms, and young people organized a team to clean sidewalks of those who cannot. There was no official list of pledges. There was a shift in attitude, a mindset honed by the revelation of that night. The hero walked among everyone with the new necklace, not understanding the dimension, but understanding the essential. Wherever there was a call, he would go. And between low conversations and long hugs, a silent consensus emerged. The city did not want to forget, because to forget would be to dishonor what has been seen. They decided then to record the story with the same simplicity that made it great. A mural on the side wall of the library features the scene of the dog in front of the snow, and next to it a phrase chosen by a vote of the children. It was not monumentality that was sought, but living memory. The journey that began with a bark and a hole in the snow now turned into a path for the cold days to come. And perhaps this is the greatest merit of a hero, not only to save a life, but to inaugurate a different way of walking together. He says, "I'm on this journey too." I want to know who feels that acknowledging this act of courage and loyalty is more than applauding a moment. It is deciding, practically and daily, to keep digging where hope seems buried. When the dust of emotion begins to settle and silence again takes over the city, the memory of what happened remains vibrating like an open wound that instead of hurting, heals. The scene of the dog digging through the snow restlessly, ignoring the cold and pain in his paws, does not leave the mind of those who witnessed or heard the story. And the echoing phrase, "Even when humans lost hope," this dog's faith and instinct showed that miracles can happen, not only sounds like a beautiful conclusion, but as an urgent reminder that often the difference between defeat and the impossible turning into victory lies precisely in not giving up in the darkest instant. That night was not about statistics, nor about rescue techniques, but about something that escapes logic and connects directly to what we have most essential, the faith that refuses to die. Think for a moment about the impact of this. How many times in your life have you found yourself faced with a situation where everything seemed over, where every sign around indicated that there was no way out? It is in these hours that the human mind bends to the weight of evidence, and the word impossible takes on body. But what this dog showed is that instinct allied to courage can break through the barrier of probabilities and make room for the improbable. It is not about romanticizing pain, nor turning tragedy into spectacle, but rather revealing a hidden truth that we often forget. When an invisible force allies itself with the decision to continue, something changes. And this change, however small, can be the thread that separates the end from a new beginning. This episode forces us to reflect on the mindset we carry on our own journey. Because what we have seen is not just the story of a particular animal, it is a living metaphor for what we so often ignore within ourselves. The dog did not know how to calculate chances, did not understand statistics, did not read reports. He just followed the call of his essence. How often do we fail to listen to our own essence, suffocated by the noise of reason or the fear of defeat? This contrast is powerful because it exposes a framework that we rarely show. Life does not require certainties to move, it requires decision. And when this decision is made with courage, it opens up space for revelations that seemed inaccessible. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because there is a quiet transformation when we realize that love and courage are not abstract concepts, but practical life-saving forces. Love, when true, does not freeze in the face of risk. It throws itself, even if it hurts. Courage, when authentic, does not ask for applause, it simply acts. And when these two elements meet, the impact is immediate. It does not matter if we are talking about a dog that digs in the snow, a parent who does not give up his child, or someone who decides to get up after the fall. The movement is the same. The essence is identical. The world desperately needs such examples, because every gesture that reaffirms this truth reminds us of something that everyday life insists on erasing, that we are capable of much more than we imagine when we act out of something greater than ourselves. The fascinating thing is to observe how this type of event generates a chain reaction. The child who survived will forever carry this memory not as trauma, but as a symbol that life is insistent. Parents, looking at their child, will never see only the boy who was almost lost in the snow, but the miracle that was reborn in his arms. The community, as they come together, will not only celebrate a four-legged hero, But the revelation that miracles are not far off. They happen when someone, or something, chooses not to give up. And we, as we listen to this story, have the chance to bring to our hearts a question that can change everything. Where in my life have I allowed the impossible to convince me to stop? Behind the scenes of this narrative, there is an even deeper point. The dog did not seek recognition, did not expect medals, did not crave applause. His instinct was pure, his mission clear. This forces us to question how much our actions are guided by essence or expectation. Do we act because we believe or because we want to be seen? This hidden truth may be uncomfortable, but it is liberating. When we act out of love and selfless courage, we create space for the impossible to happen. It is almost as if the universe conspires in favor of those who indulge without calculating immediate gains. And here lies the beauty of this journey, realizing that miracles do not only happen in the snow-capped mountains, but also in the small everyday acts that often go unnoticed. The mother who insists on smiling at her child, even when everything is difficult, the friend who does not abandon in the moment of pain, the stranger who extends his hand without expecting anything in return. Every such gesture is a seed of miracle, a reminder that the extraordinary always springs from the ordinary when there is true surrender. The impact of this episode goes beyond the city that lived it. It reaches us here now because it awakens something that was asleep. It reminds us that hope is not a luxury, it is a choice. That courage is not absence of fear, it is decision in spite of fear. And that love, even in its simplest form, the instinct of a loyal dog, has enough power to change entire destinies. That's the lesson that can't be forgotten. When all seems lost, life can still surprise. And if you look closely, this kind of event reveals more than an isolated act. It shows us how individual decisions can multiply in collective effect. The dog decided to act. The firefighters decided to believe that signal. The parents decided not to give up hope. And together, these small acts intertwined in an invisible chain that broke down the barriers of the impossible. That is the power of the union. This is the impact of choices that seem small, but change everything. This story also touches on an aspect that is almost never mentioned, the hidden truth that we often underestimate the power of silent persistence. If the dog had stopped after a few minutes of digging, if it had given in to cold or exhaustion, no one would have found the child in time. The miracle did not happen at once. It was built with every paw movement, with every insistence against the snow. And this is exactly how it is in life. The extraordinary rarely happens in giant leaps. It is born from the sum of small actions repeated with faith. And this revelation is transformative. It forces us to look at our own struggles with different eyes. Because maybe what you need is not a sudden burst of luck, but to insist a little more, to keep digging even when no one believes. Maybe the impossible is just waiting for you to take one more shovel, one more step, one more try. The emotional framework of this story cannot be ignored either. The look of the dog, exhausted, but convinced. The hug of the parents, loaded with tears, but also with relief. The collective sigh of the community, as if everyone was reborn together. This set of images forms a memory that crosses generations because it touches on a universal truth. We are made to lean on each other, to be part of something bigger. And when that happens, the transformation isn't just individual, it's collective. Therefore, this scene should not be remembered only as an isolated case of rescue, but as an eternal symbol that faith, courage, and love are stronger than any storm. They do not eliminate the difficulty, but change the result. They don't erase pain, but they transform the impact it has on us. He writes, "Well, that makes sense to me. I want to see who really understood that this story is not just about a miraculous rescue, but about the quiet courage that we all carry, and that at some point may be called upon to dig through the snow in search of what matters most." This story proves that heroes can have 4 legs and an unshakable determination. And it is not just a beautiful phrase. It is a realization that crosses any border between the rational and the emotional. The dog that launched itself against the snow, guided only by instinct and love, left a trail that no statistics can measure. He showed that courage is not human exclusivity, that hope does not depend on speeches, and that miracles often use unexpected disguises to happen. When we look at what unfolded that icy night, we realize it wasn't just a rescue, it was a revelation, Revelation that life insists, revelation that loyalty has transformative power, revelation that when you choose to act, even without certainty of the result, something greater moves. Imagine the scene etched in everyone's memory. The child, frail but alive in the arms of the family, the firefighters, exhausted but radiant, the volunteers, tears streaming down their faces, hugging each other as if they had won a war. And in the center, the dog, the true hero receiving admiring glances, as if his soul had revealed to humanity a forgotten reflection. That courage and love can manifest in simple ways, but with eternal impact. This instant of encounter between vulnerability and triumph is what gives meaning to the word miracle. The most curious thing is to realize how this narrative has spread far beyond the immediate scenario. The news traveled not only through the city, but crossed borders, traveled through newspapers, radios, social networks, and every person who read or watched, even if distant, connected in some way to what had happened. It wasn't just about admiring an animal or celebrating a rescue. It was about seeing yourself reflected in that episode. Because deep down, we all carry battles that make us feel buried by the snow of life. And to hear that someone, moved by pure faith and instinct, has managed to dig until they reach the impossible, awakens within us the reminder that giving up cannot be our final choice. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because there is a hidden truth in the impact of this story that often goes unnoticed. When something like this happens, it is not only the child's life that changes, nor only that of the family, nor that of the volunteers. There is a collective transformation. The episode breaks the barrier of the individual and creates an echo that crosses entire communities, rekindling memories, inspiring decisions, moving hearts. The city, once dormant in its routine of cold and snow, was shaken by an awakening. People who might not have spoken began to exchange looks of complicity. Neighbors who might never have approached felt part of the same story. It is as if the dog has dug, beyond the snow, a space of union in the heart of each person. And the most striking thing is that this effect does not stop in the city. It extends to those who listen, to those who read, to those who watch. How many of us have not been touched by stories that we have not witnessed, but that have nonetheless transformed us? This happens because the narrative is not just about the fact itself, but about the symbol it carries. Symbols cross time, geography, cultures. Symbols become silent guides to our own choices, and this dog, without ever having read a book or heard a speech, became a universal symbol of perseverance. It is at this point that we need to reflect on the mentality that we carry on a day-to-day basis. How often do we let fear paralyze us? How often do we give in to the temptation to believe that nothing else can be done? The big lesson here is that even when logic insists on convincing us it's over, there's always a loophole to act on. There is always room for a decision that defies statistics. That's what turned that dog into a hero. It wasn't the absence of fear, but the courage to move forward in spite of it. The behind the scenes of this story also reveals something essential. There was no glamour. There was no preparation. There were no cameras waiting to register. It all happened in silence, in the darkness of the night, with the cold wind punishing faces and the snow covering any sign of hope. And just in those scenes of pain, courage blossomed. This teaches us that the most transformative moments of our journey do not happen when we are ready, but when we decide to act, even in uncertainty. And perhaps this is the greatest revelation. Life calls us at every moment to choose whether we will remain buried or whether we will dig. The impact of an act of courage always transcends invisible boundaries. The child who survived will be, for the parents, living proof that the impossible can be overcome. The family, marked by tears of relief, will always look to that dog as more than an animal. As the guardian that life has chosen to intervene, the community will forever carry the pride of having witnessed something extraordinary. And as we know this story, we now bear the responsibility to remember that courage is contagious. Just as fear spreads fast, hope can also multiply when it is true. And it is precisely here that the strength of this episode lives. It is not limited to an exciting account, it calls us to a personal journey. Because we all have snows to dig, we all face moments when darkness seems to suffocate. And it is in these moments that we need to rescue the mentality of this unlikely hero, to continue, even when everyone around seems to have given up. This is the decision that transforms not only our destiny, but also that of those connected to us. There's no denying it. This story is an invitation to reflection, an invitation to courage, an invitation to action, an invitation not to ignore the silent force we carry within us. Because if a dog can ride through snowstorms and make room for a miracle, what could we accomplish if we decided to believe a little more? And that's why, in closing this part, I want to leave you with something very simple, yet powerful. This story is not just about a rescue, it's about hope, about faith, about the transformation that is born when we don't give up. It's about looking within ourselves and recognizing that in every decision to move forward, there is the possibility of a miracle. He said, "I'm on this journey too. I want to see who really feels that this story is about so much more than snow or cold or statistics. It's about us, about the courage we carry and about the ability we have to, even at the limit, choose not to give up." After all this, if this story touched your heart the same way it touched mine, it makes perfect sense for us to continue on this journey together. Enjoy and subscribe here on the channel, because I always bring content that carries that same spirit of transformation and hope, and I really want you to be part of it. If you made it to the end, leave here in the comments the phrase, "I'm with you to the end," so I know who really lived this experience with me until the last words. And of course, if this video made sense to you, leave your like, because it is this simple gesture that shows that it is worth continuing to share stories like this. Oh, and it doesn't stop there. There is a video here on the side that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there.